we're gonna go into science-backed research on how you can get more swole quads, and we're gonna start right now. All right, so when we're looking at building quads, I think there's a couple different factors that we've got to think about. One, why do we want big quads? If we've got somebody who tends to be taller, they likely have suffered from small quad syndrome their entire life, and they can't fill out their pants. Their hamstrings are huge, but their quads are tiny. They see people like sprint cyclists, bodybuilders, throwers with just these huge, big quads that look powerful, and they feel bad about themselves. They don't have the teardrop. They don't have the sweep. Nothing is actually lining up for those swole quads that the weightlifters have, and they just are constantly judging themselves. So the first thing that we can do is just look at research and say, okay, how can we build the VMO, the rectus femoris, the vastus lateralis? How can we really get these muscles to get a little bit meatier? And meatier as in more meat, not a meteor. And then if we can take that and start to apply that into our own training, that's gonna help us get more swole quads. Fortunately, for someone like myself who's got extremely long legs, who has always struggled with adding size to the quads, I was able to find a really sweet research paper that compared the leg extension to a leg press. Okay, and some of those movements that we could look at for adding quad size, or some of those movements that I've always felt have really targeted my quads, would be like closer stance front squat, a heels elevated front squat, a close stance single leg squat with my heels elevated, Spanish squats with very high reps, goblet squats with my heels elevated in a slow eccentric, sled pull, walking backwards while squatting, and then finally, there's no movements. I don't care what you guys say. You can comment down below that leg extensions hurt your knee. You're full of crap. Leg extensions give me the most absurd pump along with leg press. Biggest quad pump that I can get is always going to be from the leg extension and the leg press. And honestly, I at times have even used those as pre-fatigue movements. So fortunately for us, Dorado et al. Put together a sweet paper where we're looking at different time course recovery of muscle edema within the quadriceps femoris and functional performance after single versus multi-joint exercises. And so we're gonna break this down. We're gonna look at this paper, and we've just gotta remember a couple key factors. What they're looking at is muscle edema. So the healing, the trauma that is actually put on to this specific muscle within the quadriceps femoris here. And then they're looking at functional performance after lower body single and multiple multi-joint exercises. So for this actual design, they took 14 untrained young males, okay, 14 of them, and they did a leg extension, which they're calling a knee extension exercise, and they did it unilaterally. So they did, let's say they did the right leg, and then they did the unilateral leg press here, and they did it in a counterbalanced order. So let's just theoretically say they do the right leg on leg extension, and then they do the left leg on leg press. And then they took measurements before the test, after the test, immediately after, 24 hours after, 48 hours after, 72 hours after, and 96 hours after the exercise, okay? And they were measuring peak torque. So this is a big, peak torque is something that, especially in the world of sports performance, it's going to be a really important tool to measure, a really important measurement to gather, because it can lead to how much force are you able to produce from that specific joint, from that knee joint. Then we're looking at unilateral counter movement jump performance. That's really specific to sports performance. I like that because counter movement jumps, bilateral counter movement jumps like the dip and jump in a vertical jump, has a huge indication on speed performance, on sprint performance. So a unilateral counter movement jump is probably even better as far as sprint performance. So I want to just keep that in mind. And then rectus femoris and vastus lateralis muscle thickness were also recorded in both legs. When we're looking at, we just got to think PT, that's going to be peak torque. It decreased immediately after both exercises. So they did the movements and there was fatigue. They did the knee extension, they did the leg press here, and it was diminished immediately. It was fully recovered, sorry guys, fully recovered after 24 hours in the knee extension. So the leg extensions, it was recovered 24 hours later. And in 48 hours after the leg press, that peak torque was recovered. And I'm wondering right away, okay, leg press probably had a greater load. There's a little bit more of hip action. So on the eccentric, I would theorize there's more weight, and therefore you are fatiguing the muscle potentially, or fatiguing the neural drive potentially a little bit more because of the load, because of that mechanical tension. And so it would take you a little bit more to regain that peak torque. That's going to play a role in some of the performance indicators. Okay, the next big concept here is that jump height and power in the unilateral counter movement followed the same recovery pattern, okay, the same recovery pattern. So it followed exactly what peak torque, peak torque recovery pattern. So that's what I just stated. I'm actually smart.
I am smart. SMRT.
Maybe not smart, but I'm actually understanding this here, is that if we're gonna see a diminishment from leg extensions after 24 hours, it'll be restored. If we're seeing the peak torque diminishment of power and it's fully restored after 48 hours, then when we analyze jump height and power output, it's gonna take the same. If you did a leg extension, it's gonna be 24 hours before you get back to baseline. If you did the leg press, it's gonna be 48 hours before you get back to baseline. Very likely because of the leg press having more load. However, vertical stiffness, okay, so this is gonna be a way that we can indicate sprints and stuff like that, was not affected at any point after both protocols. Rectus femoris thickness increased after both exercises, so that's great. You can get swole quads, that's good news for me. And was fully restored 48 hours after leg extension and 96 hours after leg press. So again, this is sort of following a similar recovery pattern where it takes a little bit longer to recover from the leg press, just a little bit longer. The vastus lateralis thickness increased here. Okay, the vastus lateralis thickness increased after both exercises and was fully restored 24 hours after leg press and 48 hours after leg extension. So now what's interesting is that we're starting to see, okay, when the vastus lateralis thickness increases, it actually takes longer to get restored after leg extensions. So that's an interesting thing when we're just looking at size. It takes longer for the leg extension. So the leg press exercise compared to the leg extension induced more prolonged impairment of functional performance. Very, very likely because we probably had more weight on the leg press, working through more joint patterns, more joint activation as well. And the leg press exercise, when compared to the leg extension, had a delayed recovery of rectus femoris muscle edema. Okay, so that's something we've got to think about. However, the vastus lateralis edema-induced muscle swelling recovery was delayed after the leg extension. So if you're struggling with a specific part of the quad, typically the sweep here, now what we're gonna see is we should probably be doing more leg extensions because the edema-induced muscle swelling takes much longer to recover from that leg extension. And the different recovery, this is the cool part, the different recovery kinetics between functional performance and muscle damage should be taken into consideration depending on the objectives of the next training session. So if we're looking at something like size, okay, if we're looking at building size, what I would say is that especially one unique tip, and we've done some videos where we've talked about leaning back a bit on the leg extension because that can lead to a little bit more targeting of the quad, specifically in this case, likely the vastus lateralis. If we're looking at size, we might really want to get high volume leg extensions, okay? And let's say you do leg extensions and maybe for like just the next day or two, you do some sleds and you stay away from your legs, if we're focusing on size. The interesting part is that if we're focusing on performance of the leg press takes longer. So to do jumps or something, let's say we have a sprint cyclist. So sprint cyclists can benefit from doing a single leg press, 100%. It will help them in their start and it will help applying pressure into the pedal. What we want to just keep in mind is that if we've got, let's say, a sprint cyclist or a sprinter or a football player who we're going to be doing starts, let's say this is a good example, they're going to be practicing their starts. We should do the start work first, the sprint work first, and then if they need to improve their power output, they can do leg presses after that session, and then they should have about 2 days to recover from the starts and from that leg press based off of this research. So Dorado et al. Is looking at this and saying, if we're focusing on size, you're probably going to get a little bit more swole quads, especially the vastus lateralis from the leg extension. and we've got to be aware of what that impact could do in regards to fatigue management. If we're looking at performance-based perspective, we want to make sure that that single leg press is happening after we focus on starts or after we focus on single leg jumps, after we do an athlete day. And guys, remember too, inside of Peak Strength, when we're laying out our programming, this is our strength training app. We have a leg power day, we have an upper body day, we have an athlete day. So that athlete day inside of Peak Strength is where we're going to be focusing on power output, jumping capability, bounds, sprinting capability. That's happening on athlete day. So we would hit that athlete day, and then potentially after athlete day, we want to get into the weight room. And let's say if we're dealing with sprint cyclists or sprinters and we're doing single leg squats or leg presses, explosive leg presses, we then have to realize that from that fatigue, from that leg press, our jumping capability could be hindered, 24 hours later, 48 hours later, and that's fine. Okay, that's okay. We just got to be aware of that from fatigue management so that we don't end up frying the athlete. Now, the interesting part is that if you do end up training that power output and you're looking at it from the perspective of performance, but then you say, okay, 48 hours later, we can recover and we can target it with a single joint movement like a leg extension if we want to lead to more hypertrophy. We're in a volume phase like the exposure phase of the comprehension phase. So this paper provides us a very interesting perspective on how the body handles something like leg extensions compared to leg presses, and which specific muscle inside the quadriceps collective takes longer to recover from. And then also the interesting part is that the vastus lateralis plays a role in performance, but because it takes longer to recover from the leg extension and looking at the leg press having a negative impact on jumping ability, I would probably say it doesn't play as important a role as like the rectus femoris. So I wanted to share this with you guys. It's an interesting study. I love it because it's also, we're looking at right here, one of the cool aspects is that it's within participant unilateral and contralateral experimental design. So it's one leg on the other versus the other leg. They're using the same individual. And this is very similar to one of the papers that we covered earlier in the year where we went over in 2023, where we went over endurance-based work on one leg versus quad development on that same leg. So it's a very cool study. It's something that we can apply directly into training. If you guys need help with your training, head over to peakstrength.app, the Google Play Store or the Apple iOS Store. Download Peak Strength today. You get 7 free days of training and you're gonna get into that leg power day, that athlete day to get more explosive, but then you're also gonna get some of that impulse work to get a little bit more of that swole quad. Because remember, freaks, if you wanna become a champion, you've always gotta cultivate your power. Peace.